Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, White Zulu, and I hope you had an amazing Christmas with your family, lots of festivities, and a lot of peace and harmony in with your families. And I hope you weren't too hard hit by load shedding. I'm quite sure that the government or Eskom didn't give you a break over Christmas. Anyway, I'm back with another chapter for you. And this is chapter 19, the very, very first start of the small amount of schooling which I received. And it's chapter 19, Our Governess, Mrs. Bannatyne. By law, after the age of 5, we had to receive schooling of some sort, and Mrs. Bannatyne, the farm manager's wife, who professed to be a retired school teacher, seemed to be the perfect solution to the problem of our education. So my parents arranged that she would become our governess, a fancy name for someone who was going to homeschool us. They were so disinterested in educating any of their daughters, I doubt that they ever even checked her credentials. So when my mother took Dine and me along to the manager's cottage to hand us over for our first day's schooling, she would have been 5 and I was 3, I think. I can't remember actually, but they didn't hustle us into school very early. I could have been 5 and she could have been 8, I don't know. So when my mother took Diane and me along to the manager's cottage to hand us over for our first day's schooling, we were the guinea pigs in this educational exercise, because Nicolette had already left 2 years earlier to attend the preparatory school at St. Anne's, and Delia was still far too young. Mrs. Bannatyne looked at us both indulgently and said warmly, "Oh, of course I'll be able to teach them, Mrs. Ross. We shall have such fun learning, won't we, girls?" and wrung her hands ecstatically in front of her sagging bosom. As she rubbed her pale, dry hands together, her skin made a rustling noise which reminded me of a snake's scales, and she smiled at us, baring her rather large yellowish teeth. I was slightly alarmed and shrank back as she bent forward to have a closer look at us. She smelt of mothballs. The minute my mother left and walked off back up the driveway to go home, Mrs. Bannatyne turned to us and narrowed her eyes. "Go into the schoolroom," she snapped. Looked at her blankly. We had only rudimentary English, as our first language was Zulu. "The schoolroom," she repeated loudly, and shoved us none too gently towards a bedroom, their spare room at the back of their small house, which had been turned into a schoolroom. "Sit at your desks," she barked, and we stared around the room. There were 2 small tables with hard wooden chairs set against them. We slunk into the chairs. "Now sit there and fold your hands. We shall start with a hymn called All Things Bright and Beautiful." And she struck up a chord on an old upright piano in the corner of the room. We'd never even seen a piano, let alone knew what a hymn was. So we just stood there gaping like goldfish and after a minute or two, she slammed the piano lid shut and sighed in exasperation. I had no idea you were so ignorant. This was an inauspicious start and did not bode well for our future, especially as I had already developed a hooded eye and challenging look about me. I was 5 years old and knew everything there was to know in the world. She mistook this as cheeky. Take that insolent look off your face this instant, she snapped. I continued to stare at her, wondering what insolent meant. What? I asked. What do you mean, what? She demanded furiously. Her face is inches from me, so close that I could feel her spit settling on me like fine mist. What did you say? I faltered. You mean I beg your pardon, she yelled. It's rude to say what? Later, that interminable, or after that interminable ordeal of our first morning in her schoolroom, Diane and I went forlornly home, and spent the rest of the afternoon kicking sullenly around at the back of the house, hating Mrs. Bannatyne. In the evening, we were sitting on the big chintz sofa in the sitting room with my mother and my father while they enjoyed their first whiskies. And Diane said something to me in a low voice. I beg your pardon, I replied. My mother's head snapped up from her knitting where she was counting stitches, and she looked at me over her reading glasses, eyes narrowed. What did you say? She demanded. I said, I beg your pardon, I replied. Never, ever use that expression. It's common. She pointed one of her pink knitting needles at me for emphasis. But Mrs. Bannatyne says, I don't care what Mrs. Bannatyne says. It's vulgar and you're never to use it in this house. If you haven't heard properly, say what? But I tried to protest, then realized it was a hopeless cause. Mrs. Bannatyne had never had any children of her own. Apparently, she'd had very little to do with children either, giving lie to her claim that she was a schoolteacher. She was impatient, bad-tempered, and scathing. She was also sarcastic and disparaging about our shortcomings, particularly in arithmetic. We'd never heard of the times tables, and try as she might, making us chant 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 2 is 4, over and over again, we never got them into our heads. Her thin, dry beige lips were set in a permanent slit of disapproval, and her pale blue gimlet-like eyes cast a contemptuous examination over our admittedly rather wild-looking appearance. Our dark hair, mine was almost pitch black and Diane's a lighter brown, although it was kept short, invariably became shaggy between sporadic trips to our nearest hairdresser, way out in Moy River. We'd also managed to get covered in red dust during the short walk to her house, and we had big startled eyes. Excuse me. The whites showing as we looked suspiciously around us and wondered about an escape. In retrospect, she must have been lonely, stuck out on a remote ranch in the Natal Midlands. She was certainly bitter. English by origin, she had come out ostensibly to teach in East Griqualand, where she'd met and married a farm manager. She had learnt to speak a few words of kitchen Zulu, but had refused to integrate any further into African life. Jane and I would be dressed and given breakfast by Evelina and then sent over the hill to walk the half-mile to school every morning. We walked past the pigsty on our way over there, and it was tempting to stop, climb through the barbed wire fence, ripping our dresses, which were worn at Mrs. Bannatyne's insistence. She said it wasn't ladylike to wear shorts to school. Throw handfuls of rich green kikuyu grass into the pen for the pigs. We loved the pigs and often went over to spend an hour or two there, watching them squabble and squeal as they competed for the delicacies we threw in for them. Then we scratched their pink hairy backs with a long stick, which we'd picked from underneath one of the gum trees nearby. We went reluctantly, dragging our shoes in the dust. They were another insult. Mrs. Bannatyne insisted that we wore shoes to school. On our arrival, we were minutely inspected. Go and wash the dirt off your faces, she told us, with distaste, and tidy your hair. So we tramped off to her bathroom, wet our hands, and scraped them over our faces and tried to flatten our hair. Two mean, snappy fox terriers, JT and Rosette, whose unclipped nails made a clicking, scrabbling noise as they trotted after her on the over-polished wooden floors. Once we'd sat down, they lay under our tables turned desks and rooted for fleas, while we laboured reluctantly over our sums. Their fleas hopped onto our ankles and worked their way up our legs, biting us all over. We scratched at the itchy spots and were told sharply not to fidget. She droned on with her lessons. Days later, I couldn't bear the itching any more, and I pulled up my dress on arrival for our lessons to reveal a circle of angry-looking raised red wheels around my waist. The fleas had had to negotiate the waistband of my brooks and paused there to feed even more voraciously. Bannatyne was shocked at my audacity to suggest that her dog had given us fleas. Those marks are from constipation, she said. That means you don't go to the lavatory properly, and the result is that your jobs are trying to come out through your skin. How she came up with this explanation, I have no idea. But from then on, she made us each sit on the lavatory, as she called it, for half an hour before class. We weren't allowed off until we'd produced a job. This meant that we had to strain, grunting and pushing to get something, however small, out in order to be released, and just added yet another aspect to our daily torment. Her house had a strong smell of lavender furniture polish, cobra furniture polish, which tried unsuccessfully to compete with the stink of whatever diabolical, toxic-smelling concoction lay stewing in a black iron pot on the wood stove in her kitchen. Mrs. Bannatyne had stuck doggedly to her native cuisine, and we giggled behind our books as we heard her trying to describe to her baffled cookwoman in her tortuous Zulu some complicated English recipe for their dinner. Horrible stews bubbled ominously on her hob, and casseroles of vegetables simmered to a pulp in the heat of our African summers. It was a grandfather clock ticking away the seconds of our interminable mornings. Bluebottle flies buzzed frantically at the window panes, trying to escape, and if we fidgeted or gazed out at the glorious freedom beyond the windows, she rapped us sharply over the knuckles with her wooden ruler. During our morning break, we ate our luncheon, her term for the Marmite sandwich Masango had been instructed to make for us each day, and which we carried to school wrapped in greaseproof paper. Referred to what we called lunch at home as dinner. Worst of all, she'd decided that we were too thin and didn't drink enough milk. So every day she made us sit and force down a teacup full of tepid milk. Like us, the Bannatynes had a bucket of fresh milk delivered to the house every morning by Petros, the Zulu who did all the milking for us. At home, ours went straight into the fridge, but hers lay in their hot kitchen until mid-morning. Our 2 cupfuls sitting on the table beneath a crocheted fly cover, which crawled with black flies. By our morning break time, it was just about to turn. I never drank milk at the best of times, even if it was offered to me ice cold. I simply didn't like the taste or texture of it. So, this was a particularly cruel fate for me. Mrs. Bannatyne's teacups hadn't been washed properly and smelt of rotten eggs, which added to my misery as I gagged and tried not to heave it all up. The final straw was when I found a drowned fly in my cup of milk as I was reluctantly sipping it one morning, and, unable to make it to the lavatory, as she insisted we call it, I threw up the lot, including my breakfast, all over her bathroom floor. She slapped me hard once or twice on my bare upper arm for this transgression, as well as then having to continue drinking my daily dose of milk. I think Mrs. Bannatyne was slightly mad, driven crazy by loneliness and boredom. She couldn't drive, had never driven, and didn't seem to have any friends. So she spent week after week stuck out on the farm, and only when her husband had a weekend off could she get a lift into Nottingham Road with him for a change of scenery. The village had nothing to offer anyway. There was no coffee shop, no library, nothing but a couple of filling stations, a blacksmith, and the tiny post office. A filthy, fly-infested butchery, Hewson's general dealer, and of course the bottle store, the Nottingham Road Hotel's off-licence, were the only shops. Apart from these attractions, There was the railway station and the stockyards. Like ours, the Bannatyne's groceries were collected in a cardboard box by whoever went by the store, either my mother on her way back from tennis or my father passing by on his way home from his weekly 18 holes of golf at the Pietermaritzburg Country Club. And so Mrs. Bannatyne had to ring Houson's general dealers on the party line to order her groceries like everybody else did. She harried her servants mercilessly, standing over them to make sure they cleaned properly. And that was just the house, not the kitchen. The unfortunate Zulu maid had to spread layers of lavender-scented cobra floor polish onto the floor every morning, and then labouring on all fours with pads of sheepskin, one on each hand and one on each knee, had to polish the wood until it was slippery and mirror-like. Mrs. Bannatyne seemed to have a blind spot when it came to her kitchen, however, because it was squalid. It was a small, stiflingly hot room off their cramped back veranda, so there was no proper ventilation. There was a black Dover stove, wood stove, taking up most of one side of the room, over which her perspiring Zulu cookwoman toiled day after day. A wooden table stood in the middle of the tiny kitchen, and a rusting, grubby, greyish fridge stood against the other wall. Piles of chipped enamel bowls, pans, and pie dishes lay stacked on a shelf beside the stove, and the whole room crawled with flies. There seemed to be so many more of them than in our kitchen at home, although that was far from spotless. "Nangu's a filthy bugger," my mother said at intervals, after having made one of her infrequent forays into the kitchen to tell him what to cook. After lunch, when Masango was back in his thatched hut on his afternoon break, my mother smelled something odd emanating from the kitchen and went in to investigate. The oven was on and set to a low heat, and on opening the door, she found his tackies, his trainers, drying off in there. The footwear part of Masango's uniform consisted of a pair of cheap tennis shoes bought from Houson's, and he was supposed to wear them in the kitchen only. Judging by the state of them, it looked as though he'd walked in them back and forth to his home village, Mbandla, several times. They were filthy, encrusted with mud, and had holes where some of his toes had burst through. I suspect that they were the only pair of shoes he owned, as, like most Zulus on the farm, he'd been barefoot all his life. My mother was apoplectic with rage, switched the oven off, and picking the tackies up by the frayed laces, she hurled them out of the kitchen door and glared at them as they bounced down the steps. When Masango came back on duty at 4 that afternoon, she waded into him with a tirade on cleanliness and made him scrub the oven out. Years later, my mother developed hypertension, which was discovered by chance during a routine visit to their GP in Howick for a health checkup for insurance purposes. He took her blood pressure, found it to be dangerously high, and told her she'd have to take medication for the rest of her life. It's Masangu's fault. I blame it on him, having to put up with his filthy habits for all those years, she said bitterly, every time she had to swallow all those damn pills. For our morning break, Mrs. Bannatyne sent us out into the garden. First, though, she handed us each a small tin filled with paraffin, and which had homemade wire handles which bit into our palms, and into our other hand she thrust a small stick. Our task was to go around her garden, knocking CMR beetles into the paraffin to kill them. These are black and yellow rose beetles. These are black and yellow beetles, about the size of rose beetles and the same family, and fed on her plants, especially the flowers, gobbling them up and leaving great big holes in the leaves. The CMR referred to the Colonial Mounted Rifles, an old established Durban regiment whose colours were black and yellow, and Grandpa had appropriated this name for them. So, each morning, we spent the best part of an hour trudging around the garden in the blazing heat, slopping paraffin over ourselves, and dejectedly knocking beetles off our governess's plants and into the tins. We told my mother about this task when, after a few weeks, she asked why we always stank of paraffin after school. She was outraged. We're paying good money to her for your education, just so that she can get you to eradicate her garden pests, she exclaimed furiously. I never did anything about it, though, and I suspect that privately my mother thought what a damn good idea it was, and when she had a CMR beetle infestation, I noticed that her gardening Zulu woman also went around with sticks and tins of paraffin. Subjected ourselves to this ordeal for a few weeks longer, becoming more and more disillusioned about this wonderful idea of school we'd read about so avidly in our Enid Blyton books. One morning, we set off for school as usual, and once over the brow of the hill, kicked off our shoes into the grass and raced over to a path which led up to the gum tree-covered hill. We could hear the chatter of Zulu boys on their way to herd cattle on the mountainside behind the farmstead. We spent a wonderful morning with them, picking wildflowers, examining iridescent bluish-green beetles, and helping to smoke a swarm of bees out of a hive. These are wild African bees, out of a hive in a hollow tree trunk in the forest nearby, into the forest, nearly setting fire to a nearby pine plantation in the process. When we heard the noon bell ring, this was an old plowshare dangling on wire from a tree, on which Mackay would go out and hammer with an iron bar, sounding the hours of noon and 2, marking the farm lunch break. We raced back, grabbed our shoes, and reappeared sedately in the nursery for lunch. Following morning, we expected a sound reprimand from my mother for skipping school. But there was nothing. Silence. And so we did our disappearing act again and spent the day herding cattle with the Zulus and making small clay oxen from mud near the river. From then on, we continued our charade of getting dressed and trotting meekly over the hill on school days, apparently to Mrs. Bannatyne's, then peeling off barefooted to join the herd boys. Nationalist government did not make it compulsory for African children to attend school. So it was just us whites who had to go, which I felt was most unfair. I didn't see why I should sit in a dreary old classroom while they played outside in the sun or ran off into the hills to herd cattle. So I remedied the situation by bunking off from our governess whenever possible. Diana did the same. Ironically, later on, when both our older sisters, Nicolette and Diane, were at boarding school, and Delia and I were supposed to be at Mrs. Bannatyne's for our own lessons, we rounded up Bongi, Jabu, Danda, and any other Zulu children who were mooching around at a loose end and bunked off down to the river, where we played schools, choosing a flattish upright boulder as a blackboard. A self-appointed teacher, usually me, wrote out lessons using soft, different pebbles as chalk. Naturally, the teacher was bossy and dictatorial, yelling at her most recalcitrant pupil, invariably Delia, and eventually making her stand in the corner for some invented misdemeanor. This was a carefully chosen boulder next to the deepest pool. Once the pupil's back was turned, the teacher selected a rock about the size of a rugby ball and hurled it into the water from head height, the resulting splash soaking the dunce from head to foot. The classes invariably ended up in a knockdown, maul on the ground, and drag-out fight, with the white child stamping off crying, pelting the other white teacher with clods of earth and muttering threats of terrible retribution. "I hate you, you bloody swine. I'll get you back and kill you when you're not looking." The Zulu children watched this spectacle of bad behavior with some alarm, the whites of their big eyes showing nervously in their small brown faces. God alone knows what these kids thought school must be like, though, if our example was anything to go by. To be avoided at all costs, I suspect. That's it for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think it might be New Year when I see you next, so I'm going to wish you all a happy New Year. I want to thank John Moslane for all the work he does, setting aside every Friday to do these videos with me. Without him, I couldn't do it. I'd like you to visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com for photographs and more. And I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. It's goodbye from me.